So, you've played Persona 5, thought it was an awesome game, pretty unique experience, and you thought to yourself, hey, this is a Shin Megami Tensei game, or at least it's a spin-off, and that Shin Megami Tensei V game, that's coming out. Maybe I should give that a chance. Well, before you do, you should probably see this video first. Now, this is likely going to come out a week after the game came out, and early adopters can't help themselves, so you've probably already played the game and either been pleasantly surprised or disappointed. There's really no in-between when it comes to this game. You'll see why. But for you holdouts and the patient gamers, I used to be one of you before I started these videos. Let's talk about what makes the mainline series of games stand out from the vastly more popular spin-off series. But before we do the things the algorithm likes, you all know what that means. But this time, let's try a fun little experiment. Comment down below what your favorite JRPG is, unless it's on the Super Nintendo, in which case, shut the hell up, old man. Also, if you write down Persona 5, that's an instant ban from the channel. Get the fuck out of here. I'm just joking, guys, alright? Relax. Also, an important disclaimer, but some of you may know that I had cripplingly bad food poisoning. I couldn't do anything for 2 days, so that did set me back a bit. I haven't finished the game, and this is a very long game. Not as long as Persona, thankfully. Definitely wouldn't have finished this on time if it was Persona. I'm not even going to say how many hours I put into the game, because I know you're probably going to decide whether or not you want to see the review based on that alone. But either way, I thought you should know I haven't finished it. I didn't have time. Sorry, I can't play games 10 hours a day, every day. Even I have some responsibilities. That's all, though. Without further ado, let's befriend some demons. So Persona 5 obviously brought a lot of new fans into the SMT franchise. Ironically, my experience with these games is also only Persona, but unlike most modern fans of the series, I started with Persona 3, which started the whole social link high school simulation experience. But you definitely shouldn't go into this game expecting that experience, because none of those mechanics are in this game. But yeah, no social links, no going to school every day, no time management with the different activities and making money and boosting your stats. No, none of that is in this. This is basically if you just took the combat sections from those games and made them better. If you play JRPGs for the story mainly, and combat is just an excuse for you to get to the next cutscene, you're probably not going to like this game. That's not to say you should write it off completely, because believe it or not, it has one of the best combat systems in a turn-based RPG. So that in itself can be fun for a while. The problem is it also has a lot of the same trappings as JRPGs that are heavy on combat. So the question is, what type of JRPG is Shin Megami Tensei? Well, it's sort of like a Pokemon Light in some ways. It doesn't exactly have the same appeal as Pokemon. While you do recruit demons, and the way you recruit them is actually pretty entertaining. We'll get into that soon. You never get attached to any of your demons. Much like the Personas in Persona, you fuse the demons into stronger demons, and you're constantly recruiting new ones as well that get stronger and stronger, so there's no personal attachment. Not to mention, you actually fight with the demons. Your character is a Nahobino, which for the sake of brevity, is just a human combined with a demon, which in the story is a really powerful combination because demons lack the knowledge given to humans by God. Also, for some reason, it turns the protagonist into a femboy, but we'll talk about that eventually. So this is where we get into the gameplay mechanics, and this is gonna be pretty hefty because this is a complex game. So if you don't really like game mechanics discussions, well, I'm sorry, this is the meat of the game. Most of the game is battling. Everything else is tertiary to it. So, if you played Persona, you'll be fairly familiar with this combat system already because, yeah, those games were spin-offs of these games, so the combat is very similar. But, just in case you haven't, I'll briefly go over how it works. You have 4 party members, it's turn-based, all characters in the game basically have resistances or weaknesses or immunities to certain elements. Fire, ice, lightning, wind, light, dark. There's status ailments like sleep, poison, confusion, mirage, And you can have resistances or immunities or weaknesses to any of these things. Now, if you or an enemy exploits one of these weaknesses, you get an extra turn. You can have up to 4 extra turns, depending on how many active party members you currently have. You also get an extra turn for switching any of your party members out for another one. And there's other minor details, but that's basically how the general flow works. So weaknesses aren't quite as broken as something like Pokemon, where it's the entire balance of the system. No, weaknesses is only like a 25% damage boost or something like that. Really, you're just exploiting weaknesses for the extra turns. And this is the type of game where enemies and you can die in 2 to 3 attacks, unless it's a boss, of course. The bosses in this game are huge damage sponges. So even normal encounters can be a threat if you're not paying attention, especially if you don't know the demon's weaknesses or immunities. Because just like you can gain turns, you can also lose them. If any of your attacks miss, or you hit a demon's immunity to a certain element, you lose an extra turn. This can be a little bit frustrating because obviously missing is kind of random, while the agility stat does increase your accuracy and evasion. It's still no guarantee of a hit. So if you just randomly miss, that could fuck up everything, basically. Probably the best and maybe worst part of this combat system is that the entire flow of battle can change in 1 turn. For example, if one of your allies dies, the only character that can swap out an empty slot is your playable character. Otherwise, it'll just skip the empty slot's turn. And if you start a turn with less than 4 demons, you're actually losing 2 potential turns if you could have exploited a weakness with that 4th demon. And if you lose 2 demons in an enemy turn, well, you're probably fucked. Which kind of brings me to the difficulty of the game. This is definitely an above average difficulty game. I'm not going to say like, oh, it's the Dark Souls of JRPGs. No, it's not that hard. Though there is a hard mode that I've heard is very, very difficult. So I've decided to only play it on normal because honestly, it sounds like the enemies just get even spongier and you just get weaker. So, you know, poorly designed difficulty at its finest. Normal was challenging enough for me for certain, and honestly the worst part of it is the beginning of the game. The game does explain the basics of the mechanics, but doesn't exactly tell you how to play. Even understanding Persona combat didn't exactly prepare me for the beginning. The enemies are very unforgiving. Then there's the first boss. The Hydra notoriously has become a wall for a lot of players from what I've read. I was lucky enough to beat him on the first try, literally on the last possible turn I could have. I lost 3 of my demons because he spammed Fire Breath 3 times, and it was literally only my playable character left, which I think this is a good time to mention that if your character dies at any time, it's game over. Your demons cannot revive you. And yeah, the Hydra, he was a pretty good challenge. The main boss of that area, Nuwa, who's like a goddess, she actually did kick my ass the first time, and then I came back with a team much better suited to fighting her, which is one of the things I kind of like about this game, kind of don't like. As I talked about my Metroid Dread review, I'm not a huge fan of trial and error difficulty, and while this game doesn't do it that poorly, I would also compare it to Metroid Dread where, yeah, you might lose the first time, but by the second or third time, you'll definitely get it. You understand everything that's happening. Especially since you're actually given some really powerful usable items. They're called dampeners, and you can hold up to 3 of them of each element. And basically when you use them, it blocks that element type damage for an entire turn. So while a boss is charging up their Magatsui super meter, which we'll get to in a sec, if you know their element type, which you can figure out easily with the spyglass and just guess which one is the strong move, you can completely nullify that entire turn's damage. Slightly future synthetic man here. Originally, there was a section here where I said the difficulty curve flattened, but then I got to the end of the second zone and got my ass handed to me by Lamu a couple times, had to grind a bit, beat him, got to the third zone, and suddenly, enemy levels skyrocketed. And in this game, level is extremely important. if your demons are more than 5 levels below the enemy, they can get killed in one hit. So of course this meant I had to do a lot of grinding. Up until this point, the grinding was kind of manageable, but the way that it works in this game is that the larger the gap between you and your enemy, the more EXP you get at the end of the battle. Problem is that demons level up pretty slowly, so that's why fusing is so important. But I was swiftly getting to the point where most of the fusions were such a higher level than even myself that I was kind of just stuck for a while, just grinding against the highest level enemy in that area. And yeah, it was kind of boring. And that was pretty much where I ended my playtime for the sake of this review. I'll probably finish the game afterward, but just wanted to let you know that the game gets grindier around level 40. Another interesting mechanic that kind of felt underutilized is the Magetsui. Basically, you get access to this ultimate move once your gauge is full, and you fill up the gauge just by attacking enemies, exploiting weaknesses, etc., etc. You actually expand the ways that you can fill that meter throughout the game when you upgrade yourself, which we'll get to in a little bit. But the default Magetsui makes all of your attacks free criticals. Now, this sounds very overpowered, and it kind of is, but the game is also a little balanced around it as well. So it's not so much that this move feels overpowered so much as all the other ones feel underpowered, because some demons can have their own Magetsuis. The problem is, what's as good as 4 free extra turns without having to exploit weaknesses? And all these attacks are doing like 50% more damage anyway, because yes, a critical hit gives you a free turn, if I didn't mention before. So if you kind of know what you're doing with the ebb and flow of battle, you can take advantage of this and just pull out all your heaviest hitters and slam them with your strongest moves with Magetsui, and that can do a shit ton, obviously. Now, to balance this, enemies can also use Magetsui, even basic enemies. Now, again, in the later game, this is not really a big deal, especially if you learn how to deal with this, because guarding is actually very powerful in this game. So the game actually does warn you a turn beforehand. Unlike your Magetsui, which is a free move on your turn, the enemies, they have to prepare to use it, right? So you can guard on your turn, and it'll negate a significant amount of the damage and prevent any critical hits you would have normally received. So once you learn that, it's really not bad at all. But yeah, in the beginning, I got wiped out by that one time. It was incredibly frustrating. Obviously, like I mentioned before, there's a bunch of different magic spells that have a bunch of different effects. There's ones for each element. There's basically multiple levels of damage for each spells, but also demons can have affinity for spells, which boosts their efficacy. But at the end of the day, a level 1 fire spell, level 2 fire spell, level 3 fire spell, it's the same stuff, right? There's also moves that buff your stats, which are decent, not so good in the beginning of the game, except for lowering enemy defense. I use that one a lot, obviously. But eventually you get access to ones that buff your whole team. Those are obviously pretty damn good. And I will give a special mention to status effects that a lot of times they do work on bosses, and you can check this, it isn't just guesswork. The spyglass item, extremely useful, allows you to see a bunch of information on your enemies, including all their elemental weaknesses, resistances, immunities, their moves, and resistances or weaknesses to status effects, right? So I'll admit, I didn't come up with this on my own, but that's how I beat the Hydra on the first try, is by putting him to sleep. And sleep is obviously extremely good. So don't forget to use status effects. And yeah, that just about covers the combat mechanics. All things considered, the combat is pretty fun. It's not quite as fast as Persona because of the removal of knocking down enemies and the all-out attack, which actually ties into the next section, so I'll talk about that in a second. But it feels pretty strategic. It feels like every action you make matters, and it also feels like a battle can be won or lost in a single turn. So it has high stakes, which high stakes isn't always good for random battles. I do wish the random battles were a bit easier, but there's a lot of mini bosses and boss fights in this game. And so fighting all these new demons that you don't know the weaknesses of, even though you could just use a spyglass to figure out the enemy's moves and weaknesses pretty quickly, it's still interesting to observe their AI behavior and formulate a team that's good against a specific demon. The overall strategy isn't really that complex. I mean, it's still kind of similar to other RPGs where you exploit elemental weaknesses, you buff yourself or debuff enemies, use status effects. A lot of that's typical, but it all kind of combines to a nicely paced, just complex enough combat system that I was entertained for most of my time playing. Now on to recruiting demons, or the Pokemon element, I guess you could say. Now you'll notice in the mechanics section that I actually didn't talk about the all-out attack feature, which is something you'll remember in the Persona games, which let you end a random battle pretty quickly, because when you exploited a weakness, you knocked down the enemy. If you knocked down all the enemies, you could do an attack that would basically finish them off. Well, that's not in this game, and this ties into the demon recruitment. Because if you've only played Persona 5, you wouldn't know this, but they couldn't exactly decide on how they wanted you to recruit the Personas. It's funny because in Persona 3, it was basically just a random roulette after random battles. It was very strange. And then in Persona 5, they did something more like Shin Megami Tensei. Instead of finishing them off with an all-out attack, you could negotiate with the enemies and recruit Personas. In the SMT games, you actually just talk to the demons. Yes, I mean, you literally just walk up to them and just have a conversation, and basically, how you talk to the demons determines on whether or not they wish to join you. And for the most part, you have to give them gifts, basically money or medicine, or sometimes a damaging item, and you may have to give them up to 3 of these items, and then they'll join you. Now, at first, this is going to seem very random. You're going to get wrong answers, and you're not going to really understand why. But as you play through the game, you understand, oh, there's like personality types for each demon, right? And so you'll start to understand, oh, I should probably answer like this to this guy because he's probably like more noble, or this guy's more of a trickster, or this guy's just a dick, you know? And some of the conversations are actually pretty funny. In one of the conversations, you're talking to this skeleton guy, and he asks you to smell the air for the scent of blood, right? And he says, oh yeah, that's what survival of the fittest smells like. And for some reason, one of the answers is, I prefer the smell of barbecue. And that's the right answer. That's what I love about these. There's all sorts of ones like this, where it's just weird shit. It just kind of catches you off guard. I don't know how much of this is the localization, but I gotta say, this is definitely one of the games with a good localization. I know some of you weebs get really anal if it's not a direct translation, but obviously some things don't translate perfectly from Japanese. And I appreciated some of the references in here, and some of these dumb jokes. I actually like the stupid humor quite a bit. So after you succeed with the questions, like I said, you gotta give them some stuff, and the only limitations on recruitment are that you have to be the same level or higher than the demon you're trying to recruit, and of course you need an empty slot, because you only have a certain number of reserve slots, and there's no like bank system. Same thing with Persona. So of course what this means is that you're constantly going to be fusing your recruits into stronger recruits, which again you have to be the appropriate level to fuse. But yeah, that's basically the recruitment system. It's fun, it's kind of random, but it's not that frustrating because there's no random encounters, so if you fail to get the demon, just find him again on the world map and try again. So I think finally we'll talk about the progression system, just briefly, but I also think this is pretty nice because I don't really like it when RPGs you just level up and maybe you'll gain some skills, maybe you have a skill tree and that's it. No, the benefit of the SMT games is that there's multiple different progression systems, so it's satisfying on multiple angles. Of course, you still have the traditional, oh, you level up, you learn skills, you can only learn a certain number of skills, which can be expanded on, which is part of one of the other systems. But on top of typical leveling up and learning skills, you have fusion, like I mentioned earlier. You can fuse 2 demons, or you can perform a special fusion and fuse any number of specific demons to make some greater, much stronger demon, typically. Now, you might think with the special fusions that they would be difficult to pull off, but fortunately, there's something called the Demon Compendium, which is also in Persona, where you can spend money to get back any demon you've recruited in the past. And if you like a certain set of skills that you bred into a demon, so to speak, because when you fuse, you can inherit skills from the parents, you can actually register your modified demon into the compendium. Now, it'll be significantly more expensive, especially if you leveled up that demon. But still, that's an option if you just like the certain set of skills. Then you have the Miracles and Essence Fusion. Miracles are basically a whole bunch of different additional abilities that you upgrade the player character with. These are a pretty wide range, from upgrading your affinities with each of the magical elements to make your spells stronger, or increasing the number of ways the Magatsuki gauge can increase, or far more important ones like the amount of demons you can have in your party, the amount of skills you can have. Obviously, these should take precedent over some of these other ones. But the game does kind of let you build your character the way you want to. There's not really enough glory to go around for all this, so try and prioritize. And we'll talk about where you get glory in the next section. Then we have Essence Fusion. This is also very important. It allows you to take the skills from any other demon, which for the player character is extremely important because you don't really learn skills on your own. Now, the Aogami, which is what your character fuses with to become the Nahobino, he does have more powerful versions of himself that you can find throughout the world in essences. And the essences is where Essence Fusion comes into. Because one of the things you find in the world map, again, we'll get to in the next section, are these essences. And that's what you fuse with yourself to gain the skills of that monster. But you can also fuse the affinities from those monsters as well, which is the immunities and weaknesses. So obviously, that can be very significant, especially if you know what type of moves the bosses have beforehand, and this is where it ties back into the trial and error gameplay. If you lose the first time to a boss because your character was weak to his element, you can switch to any of your other essences where you're immune to that element. You can also fuse your other main demon party members with other demons, not affinities, but with their skills. So this can open up a huge range of combinations for your party if you really plan these things ahead of time. I didn't put that much thought into it, I'll admit, because demons have preset affinities to elements. So rarely did my characters mix and match in a perfect way like that, but a lot of planning ahead, or maybe some weaponized autism, I guess you could say, would probably make this game a lot easier. So then we have the final element of this game, which is basically anything that's not related to demons or combat, which is the open world and the characters and story, because even though I said they wouldn't get a section, they deserve a mention, I guess. So for the open world, which is probably the big departure from the previous entries in any of these games, as far as I'm aware, I don't think they've ever tried a mini sandbox approach before. They're okay. Not bad, not good, really. I'll try to stick to the positives first. Basically, you see all the enemies roaming around the world map, so no random battles, thank God. Though Persona didn't have random battles either. There were plenty of cases in those dungeons where it was kind of hard to avoid. It is much easier to avoid encounters in this game. The map does have some verticality in certain areas, which I can say is definitely a good thing. So actually exploring around and finding items and all these Miman, which are basically these little red dudes, you find them and they give you glory. On top of these bright geometrical objects that also give you a bunch of glory. And that's how you learn the miracles, so obviously seek them out. The side quests were actually pretty decent as well. Not anything special, really. I mean, some of them have goofy writing. Again, shows that the localization team is pretty damn good. But no, just the fact that you end up fighting a lot of unique mini-bosses in them, or at least demons that you won't fight until the next zone, so they feel unique at the time. It adds some more variety to the combat. There's also some super bosses in each area, or at least they're super bosses at the time you're there. and so it gives you a reason to come back to the areas later to fight these tougher bosses. And honestly, I just kind of like the mini sandbox style. It gives you just enough exploration while keeping the levels somewhat interesting to move around in. But that's about it for the positives. As for the negatives, and there's really only one that matters, and that's the fact that the first half of the game pretty much all looks the same. It's a yellow desert and a red desert with dilapidated Tokyo skyscrapers scattered around. Even when you finally get some visual variety, something about these maps just isn't really that satisfying to traverse through, and it kind of exposes the very obvious middleware budget of this game, because SMT was never as popular as Persona has been since 3, and you can honestly see why just playing this game. Persona 3, 4, and 5 offer an experience that you're really not going to see in any other video game, whereas this is more just a pretty competent JRPG. While the open worlds kind of add a flair to it that I didn't quite expect, it still is something I've seen at least a few times before. Actually, what this game reminds me a lot of is Dragon Quest Monsters Joker, which I don't know if anybody in the audience has played either of those games. I really wish the third one had come to the West. Would have played the shit out of it. But it's basically another Pokemon clone that I would argue does the Pokemon aspect better than this game, significantly, but people in the West don't really care about Dragon Quest, so it didn't do that well. But it had mini sandbox levels with the monsters roaming around the map and small exploration elements that this game does a little bit better than that. But they both have the same problems, that the world is mostly empty and it doesn't really add much, so I don't know, I'm just feeling meh on this whole sandbox thing. As for the story and characters, like I said, it doesn't really matter that much. The story is fairly standard, angels versus demons type of thing. The only thing that's kind of interesting about the Shin Megami Tensei universe is that basically all the religions are legit. A bunch of the demons you recruit in this game are literal gods from other pantheons, and the whole thing is kind of like a non-denominational Abrahamic god war, in a sense. So I guess that's cool. In the previous SMT games, I've been told that you can actually pick different routes that determine your ending, depending on like if you side with order or chaos or something. And I've been spoiled a bit, but I won't spoil for you, that they kind of dropped the ball on that in this one. I won't say how. There are a couple interesting story moments that kept my attention, but as with any good story, especially JRPGs, a story is only as good as your characters, and the only character I cared about was the main character, but he's a silent protagonist, so I barely even cared about him. But, you know, let's talk about him for a moment, because I'm sure you guys are expecting me to say something about it. And this is not going to turn into a rant or anything, I promise. But listen, I might not be a weeb, but I do know about B Shonen, okay? The pretty boys, right? This is too goddamn far. This is a goddamn twink turning into a femboy. I know Japan thinks twinks are really cool for some reason. I don't know if they've just been chugging Soylent for 30 years or more, but shonen protagonists have become more and more feminine over time, and this is the worst I've ever seen. As a Nahobino, this is a woman, but you chopped off the tits and ass. That's what this is. You drew a woman and called it a man. This is a fucking femboy. I think Japan needs to finally come out of the closet with this shit, really, because the fact that I'm supposed to believe this character is straight, I don't know, I can't do it. Honestly, I didn't really care that much, but it is a little bit distracting that our heroic male main character has a face that James Charles would be jealous of. And yeah, honestly, I have no other comment about the characters because the rest are pretty fucking forgettable. Which I really don't want to harp on this too much, because again, I don't think it was supposed to be a focus of the game, but part of the brilliance of a game like Persona 3, which at face value, the plot is very standard. A bunch of teenagers come together and save the world. It's basically every anime plot. But what's genius about the game is that throughout it, you're forming these social links, not just with your other party members, but with random people in the school or around your daily life. And so you get attached to characters in the real world and hearing their stories, and it actually makes your Persona is more powerful. I just realized I put major spoilers for Persona 3 here, so just skip to the conclusion in the chapter feature, and I'll put the timestamp here. And then the game hits you with the, the entire world is at stake here, which even the setup for that is kind of brilliant. That people wishing for the end of the world brought the end of the world. I think that's pretty powerful commentary on both psychopathic people, but even more importantly, depressed people. And so seeing SMT5 kind of just like, there's demons and you gotta recruit demons and kill demons and save Tokyo. I don't know, it's kind of boring. So, in conclusion, should you buy Shin Megami Tensei V? Yes, if you're a fan of JRPGs. If you really like JRPGs, especially if you actually like the combat in JRPGs, it's a definite yes, because it's excellent combat, if I didn't make that clear. And honestly, it's the only thing that's really going to keep you going in the game. So, unfortunately, if you don't like JRPG combat at all, well, you probably won't like this game. The story really is just not that interesting, I'm telling you. And the whole Pokemon recruitment mechanic is not really going to get anybody who likes Pokemon into this either. No matter what some of the fans will try to tell you, there's just not the same appeal. Who the hell wants to throw their Pokemon in the trash or combine two Pokemon you like to make a shitty one, you know? That said, it has its own appeal, I think, that's pretty fun about it. I like getting to use like 100 different demons over the course of the game. I think that's cool. And there's definitely a sense of progression, especially when you start getting the gods and playing around with them. I'm not entirely sure if I could recommend this to fans of Persona, because I suspect, especially for a certain demographic of fans that maybe I won't name for the sake of YouTube, they don't really like video games that much anyway, so a game that's purely about combat and requires strategy maybe won't be to your liking. Since you're really just there for the social element, you want a high school life simulator where you make friends and have relationships or whatever. Yeah, none of that's here. This is about recruiting and killing demons, and that's it. That being said, definitely a good game. Not my game of the year, but it's probably the third best game I've played this year. And yeah, go ahead and check it out. As you probably already know, JRPGs are definitely worth the money because they're very long, and this game is also very long. That being said, it's pretty debatable how much of this is actually quality content, kind of like my argument in the Far Cry 6 review, right? But I feel comfortable saying that at least it is of a consistent quality throughout the game. Hey guys, thanks for watching. Do the things the algorithm likes if you haven't already, and comment down below about your favorite JRPG like I mentioned in the beginning. Any answer is fine, seriously. And I'm going to take a break. I was thinking about reviewing Battlefield, but honestly, I really don't feel like wasting $60 on a game I already know is complete shit. Maybe it would be funny, but I honestly just saw It's a Gundam's video on it, and even though that wasn't really a review, I think it pretty much covered everything that needed to be talked about with the game, so go check out his video on it, and that's probably fine. But I do promise I will play Halo Infinite and review it. At this point, it is the last hope for a good multiplayer FPS to come out this year. But yeah, that's about it. I'll see you next time, guys.